On most Tuesday evenings in Flaxborough, the most turbulent sound to escape the Memorial Hall was the scuffle of sensible shoes against polished floorboards and the faint rattle of a tea trolley. Tonight, however, there was a squeal. Not the usual sort either, not the shy peal of girlish laughter from Mrs. Turnbull's junior embroidery class, nor the creak of old hinges that Councillor Chub insisted required municipal funds to oil. This was a sharper, more insistent sound, ending in a gasp that pulled every head in the sewing circle half an inch above its usual dutiful bend. It had begun in the corner near the piano stool, where Mrs. Tubbins, a woman whose knitting needles clicked as fast as her tongue, had been rummaging in her capacious handbag. Instead of withdrawing the expected packet of barley sugars or a photograph of her niece's twins, she produced something altogether less conventional for a Flaxborough sewing evening. A man's sock, crumpled, striped, and with what appeared, though no one dared confirm, to be a faint brown stain across the heel. The room, which had smelt of tea, wool, and camphor only seconds earlier, now held something else. Suspicion. "Good heavens, Dorcas," whispered Miss Bellringer, who regarded whispering as an unsavoury practice, but felt the occasion demanded it. "Surely that is not Mr. Tubbins's?" "It is not," replied Mrs. Tubbins with extraordinary firmness, as though the denial itself absolved her from explaining further. There followed a silence during which Mrs. Poole's teapot continued to dribble unnoticed onto its crocheted cosy. The ladies, half a dozen of them, sat rigid as dolls awaiting winding. It was Mrs. Poole herself who broke the stillness with her familiar tremolo of civic disapproval. "I cannot think," she said, "what sort of woman would carry about a man's article of underclothing in her handbag. Unless," she added with sudden relish, "it was evidence." The suggestion hovered in the air with a faint aroma of scandal. Evidence of what was never specified, but the room's collective imagination, trained on years of parish jumble sales and thinly disguised moral outrage, needed little encouragement. Before anyone could pursue the matter further, Mrs. Tubbins thrust the sock back into her bag, snapped the clasp shut with the force of a trap, and rose with a dignity quite out of proportion to her size. "Ladies," she declared, "I think we shall find that the truth, when it comes, will not be improved by speculation." With that, she waddled to the door and left, abandoning her half-finished cable-knit cardigan to the scrutiny of eyes no longer diverted by tea biscuits. Miss Bellringer, who had never quite forgiven Mrs. Tubbins for winning second prize in the church flower arranging competition, leaned across the table to Mrs. Poole. "I should not be surprised," she whispered again, "if this were a matter for the police." The word police travelled with agreeable efficiency. Within minutes it was embroidered, figuratively, for once into a tapestry of possible larceny, unmentionable behaviour, and, eventually, murder. By the time the sewing circle disbanded, half Flaxborough knew that a blood-stained garment had been discovered in Mrs. Tubbins's possession. The detail that it was only a sock, and of uncertain staining, was already being carefully shaved away by rumour's more imaginative scissors. At 9 o'clock precisely, as he eased his bicycle against the railings outside the station, Inspector Purbright was greeted by Sergeant Love with a cautious cough. "There's been a bit of a flap at the sewing circle, sir." Perbrite, who had long since learned that Flaxborough crises were as dangerous as they were urgent, which was to say, not very, removed his gloves and folded them neatly in his pocket. "A flap, love?" "Yes, sir. Something about a lady with a man's garment. Caused quite a stir." Perbrite raised an eyebrow not too high. "You don't say? Did the garment itself commit any offence, or merely exist in an unsuitable handbag?" Love coloured slightly. "Can't rightly say, sir. But Mrs. Poole has hinted she may call first thing in the morning to lodge a statement." The inspector allowed himself a small smile, one that suggested mild amusement rather than enthusiasm. Then perhaps we had better prepare a form especially designed for socks of questionable provenance. Love laughed dutifully, then added with a flicker of curiosity, "You don't think it might be serious, sir?" Purbright slipped off his overcoat and hung it on its usual peg, with the same care he might have given to an alibi. "Sergeant, in Flaxborough the most dangerous thing about a scandal is generally the relish with which it is repeated. Still, it will do no harm to listen. Tomorrow I shall make discreet inquiries." And with that he settled behind his desk, where the lamp's glow caught the faint dust rising from papers never entirely free of damp. Somewhere in the town already, tongues were wagging faster than Mrs. Tubbins's knitting needles. But Inspector Purbright, with his calm, owlish patience, knew better than to tug too soon at a loose thread. Threads, in his experience, had a way of revealing more than their owners intended. The following morning, the faint mist that had lingered overnight still clung to the pavements of Flaxborough, like an old shawl reluctant to be put away. It muffled the sound of bicycles on cobblestones and blurred the outlines of shop fronts, yet nothing, not even a persistent autumn fog, could blur the clarity with which the town transmitted gossip. By breakfast time, Mrs. Tubbins's handbag had been emptied, filled, and emptied again in at least a dozen versions, each tale acquiring new contents. In some retellings, the offending object had become a man's glove, in others, a bloodied scarf. At least one account had promoted the sock to a pair of trousers, concealed in a paper bag beneath Mrs. Tubbins's spare spectacles. At the snug breakfast table of the Red Lion, Mr. and Mrs. Garud, innkeepers of solid reputation, and ears tuned to scandal like a wireless to the home service, were already rehearsing the matter for the benefit of a lodger. "It's not the article itself, Mr. Phipps," Mrs. Garud said, slicing an egg with decisive precision. "It's the circumstances. You or I might pick up a sock in the scullery. No one would blink. But in a lady's handbag at a sewing circle, that has an implication." Mr. Phipps, who had come to Flaxborough in the hope of selling agricultural insurance, but had so far succeeded only in acquiring a child, stirred his tea gloomily. "What is the implication?" he asked, though without much expectation. Mrs. Garud leaned forward as though the wallpaper itself might be listening. "It implies that Mrs. Tubbins is keeping something back. And if a woman of her age and girth keeps something back, it must be worth keeping." Across town, in the less salubrious warmth of Pocklington's drapery, the matter was embroidered in other colours. Miss White, who prided herself on folding blouses with the exactitude of origami, told a customer in tones of hushed relish that the sock was almost certainly part of a burglary. "Why else," she asked, "would anyone carry such a thing about? Mrs. Tubbins is not a laundress, and if she were, she'd hardly be laundering gentlemen's hosiery at the Memorial Hall." The customer, who only wanted a sensible pinafore, left with her purchase, but also with a sense that the very foundations of civic life might be unravelling one stitch at a time. By mid-morning, the gossip had reached the municipal offices, where Councillor Chub received it with an air of wounded responsibility, as though socks of uncertain ownership had been thrust upon his personal conscience. "Disgraceful," he muttered, adjusting his waistcoat over an expanse that suggested the councillor's fondness for meat pies had not lessened with age. "If this sort of behaviour is allowed to continue unchecked, what's to stop people parading underclothes in the market square? The borough council will be laughed out of Lincolnshire." He resolved to raise the matter at the next committee meeting, certain that with sufficient solemnity it could be expanded into an issue of public decency requiring regulation. Meanwhile, in the station, Perbrite listened patiently to Mrs. Poole, who had indeed presented herself with the air of one bestowing an essential civic service. She described the events of the previous evening in tones of such reverence that it might have been the discovery of a relic rather than a sock. Love, seated at his typewriter, attempted to keep pace with her elaborate adjectives, though by the time she had reached the third variation of quite peculiar, his notes bore only a despairing abbreviation. Purbright did not hurry her. His head inclined slightly, his eyes blinked once or twice, and when Mrs. Poole paused, he encouraged her with a mild, "Indeed." Well, that suggested sympathy without endorsement. When she had concluded with the triumphant declaration that she had removed the teapot stain from her crocheted cosy only that morning, proof of her diligence in all matters, Purbright thanked her warmly and promised that the matter would receive every attention it merited. When she had gone, leaving behind an echo of lavender water and moral indignation, Purbright turned to Love. "Well, Sergeant, what do you make of it?" Love hesitated, his large hands poised over the keyboard as though waiting for permission. "I suppose, sir, that it could be evidence of something. Burglary, perhaps, or worse." Perbrite lifted the file Mrs. Poole had left behind and tapped it gently on the desk. "I think, love, that what we have here is evidence of Flaxborough being Flaxborough. Still, one never knows. We had better have a word with Mrs. Tubbins." By the time the inspector and his sergeant arrived at the Tubbins household on Eastgate, the tale had advanced to another stage. Neighbours, observing the police knock discreetly at the door, concluded that an arrest was imminent. A boy on a bicycle sped off with the news, which by tea-time would be transformed into the certainty that Mrs. Tubbins had been taken away in handcuffs, her handbag seized as an exhibit. Mrs. Tubbins herself opened the door with surprising composure, though her cheeks were pinker than usual and her hands bore the tremor of someone who had been stewing tea for company she did not desire. She invited them into a parlour heavy with furniture and family photographs, all of which seemed to be watching anxiously. Perbrite accepted a chair with his usual courtesy, his frame bending forward slightly in a manner that suggested interest rather than interrogation. "Mrs. Tubbins," he began, "I understand that an item was produced last night at the sewing circle which caused some comment." Her clasped hands pressed together until the knuckles whitened. "I cannot deny it, Inspector, but I swear before you that the sock is not my husband's, nor is it any man of my acquaintance." "I see," Perbrite murmured, as though this were the most natural denial in the world. "Might I ask how it came to be in your handbag?" Mrs. Tubbins looked away towards the heavy velvet curtains, which stirred faintly though the window was closed. "That is the curious part. I cannot say. I remember placing my spectacles case in the bag before I left home. I remember a packet of mints, but of the socks I have no recollection." Love, who had expected a tearful confession of guilt, frowned in puzzlement. Purbright, however, merely nodded, his head slightly tilted. Things do have a way of appearing where they are not wanted. "Would you allow me to see it?" Reluctantly, Mrs. Tubbins fetched the bag and produced the sock. It lay limp on the inspector's palm, striped in drab colours, the stain faint but present. Perbrite examined it with the detached air of a man inspecting an unfamiliar postage stamp. "Interesting," he said, softly, and returned it to her. "You will, of course, retain it, and I would be grateful if you did not mislay it again." She promised with a vehemence that startled even herself. When the policeman departed, she remained in her chair for several minutes, the bag clutched to her bosom as though it contained something far more explosive than cloth. As they walked back towards the station, Love ventured, "What do you think, sir?" Perbrite smiled faintly. "I think, Sergeant, that the sock's significance lies not in its fabric but in the pattern of its appearance. It may yet have something to tell us, but in the meantime let us leave the town to its favourite occupation, Gossip, after all, is often more revealing than testimony. And so, as Flaxborough's shopkeepers, counsellors, and housewives embroidered the story with thread finer and more tangled than anything the sewing circle could produce, Inspector Purbright allowed the fabric of rumour to weave itself a little longer, knowing that sooner or later a true stitch would show where the rest was invented. Inspector Perbrite, having concluded that the most profitable course of action at present was not to leap upon theories, but to let the various threads dangle in plain sight, set about his morning routine with the same mild composure he might have devoted to filling in a requisition form for paperclips. The sock had been seen, denied, and returned. What remained was to explore, with deliberate politeness, the perspectives of those who had either witnessed or embroidered the incident. He began with Mrs. Poole, not because her account promised reliability, but because she was the sort of woman who regarded being interviewed by the police as a natural extension of her civic duties. She greeted Purbright and Love at her terraced house with the expression of one prepared to make a full confession on behalf of the entire town. Seated in a room whose antimacassars looked as if they had been starched into armour, Mrs. Poole launched into her recital without waiting to be prompted. She described Mrs. Tubbins's dramatic production of the sock, the gasps that followed, and her own efforts to keep order among the ladies' efforts, which, she stressed, might be compared to those of a schoolmistress calming a class during an air raid. Love took down her words at a pace that required considerable abbreviation, while Perbrite interjected the occasional "indeed," or "quite so," to keep her flowing. When she reached her conclusion that Mrs. Tubbins must, in her view, be concealing some matter of shame, Perbrite merely inclined his head. "And would you say, Mrs. Poole, that the other ladies shared your impression?" "Entirely, Inspector, except for Mrs. Tubbins herself, of course, and one can hardly rely on her protestations, can one?" "Perhaps not," Perbrite agreed softly, though the flicker in his eyes suggested amusement at her certainty. He thanked her with a courtesy that made her glow for the rest of the day, as though she had advanced the cause of justice by a decisive stride. From there, Purbright and Love proceeded to the home of Miss Bellringer. She received them with a briskness that implied she had been waiting precisely for this moment. Her parlour, neat to the point of austerity, contained little by way of distraction. A single framed portrait of her late father stared sternly from the mantel as though to supervise her conversation. Miss Bellringer was less dramatic than Mrs. Poole, but far more precise. She recounted the sequence of events in a clipped manner, inserting small corrections whenever she felt the inspector's questions might lead astray. "It was not 8 o'clock, Inspector, but 5 minutes past. I recall because the church clock struck just before Mrs. Tubbins arrived. She was flushed, more than was natural for such a short walk, and she looked about the room rather than directly at anyone, as though to check whether we were all present. That was what struck me." Perbrite listened attentively, his long fingers folded in his lap. "And the sock?" Miss Bellringer's mouth thinned. "A man's, quite obviously. Striped. Cheap wool. I cannot think of a respectable explanation for its presence in her handbag." "If I may say so, Inspector, the sooner the police investigate her household, the better for all concerned." Perbrite's response was merely a mild, "We shall see, Miss Bellringer." He rose, bowed slightly, and left her with the satisfaction of believing her information would result in immediate action. On the pavement outside, Love ventured, "They don't seem to like Mrs. Tubbins much, sir." Perbrite gave a dry smile. "I think, Sergeant, that Mrs. Tubbins is merely the garment upon which they embroider their grievances, but there may still be a pattern worth noticing. Their next visit was to the Tubbins home once more, this time not to confront her, but to obtain a picture of domestic life. Mr. Tubbins, a quiet man with a perpetually astonished look, as though he had just heard a joke without the punchline, received them with courtesy but little comprehension. "I can't say I know how it got there," he said, when shown the sock again. "Not mine, certainly. My feet are a size larger, you see. And my wife, well, she doesn't go about collecting hosiery." He chuckled faintly, then sobered under Purbright's steady gaze. "But she has been uneasy, Inspector, ever since that business at the church bazaar last month." "What business would that be, Mr. Tubbins?" The man shifted in his chair. "Nothing much, only a missing purse. Caused a stir at the time. Some folk whispered Dorcas might have taken it, which is ridiculous. She never so much as kept the change from the milkman." Perbrite noted the remark with interest, but asked no further questions. Instead, he assured Mr. Tubbins that no one suspected his wife of theft, an assurance that, though not entirely accurate, soothed the man into a state of confused gratitude. By the time they returned to the station, Perbrite had accumulated not so much evidence as atmosphere. He sat at his desk, tapping the arm of his chair thoughtfully while Love attempted to summarize the statements. "Seems to me, sir, that either Mrs. Tubbins put it there herself and now regrets it, or someone else slipped it in to embarrass her." "Both possibilities are worth keeping," Perbrite said mildly. "But ask yourself, Sergeant, why a sock? If one wished to embarrass a lady, there are more colourful items to choose from. A letter, perhaps, or something more distinctly personal. A sock is ambiguous, which I suspect is precisely why it was chosen." Love scratched his head, then glanced at the object still resting in its evidence envelope. "Do you think the stain is blood, sir?" Perbrite leaned forward, adjusted his spectacles, and peered once more at the faint brown mark. "It may be," he said softly, "or it may be nothing more sinister than rust or tea. But whichever it is, I think we should consider not only how it came to be in Mrs. Tubbins's bag, but where its partner might be." Love blinked at the notion of a missing twin, as though it were a revelation. "You mean there's another sock, sir?" "Almost certainly," Perbrite replied, leaning back again, "and it may be that the other sock will prove far more eloquent than this one." Thus the day closed, not with arrests or proclamations, but with the inspector's quiet certainty that beneath Flaxborough's embroidered chatter lay a thread that, if tugged gently enough, would lead to a far less trivial design. The town did not have to wait long before its collective instinct for certainty supplied a culprit. By midweek, conversation in the butcher's queue, the post office, and the snug bar of the Royal George had reached a consensus. Mrs. Tubbins herself was to blame. The reason varied according to the Tellerone, claimed it was spite, another hinted at secret fondness for a gentleman not her husband, and a third, with relish, whispered of kleptomania, but the conclusion was the same. In Flaxborough, the convenience of a ready suspect was considered far more comforting than any lingering ambiguity. Councillor Chub, who never missed an opportunity to blend civic duty with personal authority, brought the matter up at the Borough Committee meeting. "It is high time," he declared, rising ponderously to his feet, "that the police did their part to protect the good name of this town. We cannot have scandal festering in the Memorial Hall. It is unbecoming of Flaxborough. Our ladies are entitled to feel secure in their sewing." The committee, consisting largely of men whose wives had already reported the incident to them in tones of alarm, murmured assent. Councillor Peaver, ever eager to appear practical, added that if Mrs. Tubbins had indeed engaged in misconduct, it would be best to establish it swiftly, so that the town might move on without prolonged embarrassment. From the back of the hall, the clerk ventured that, technically speaking, possession of a sock was not in itself a criminal offence. He was silenced by a general frown. The motion, though not officially recorded, was understood by all. Mrs. Tubbins was guilty until the police could persuade them otherwise. Inspector Purbright learned of this development not through any formal report, but from the obliging lips of Mrs. Garrod, who recounted the councillor's indignation while polishing glasses behind the bar. "They were very firm about it, Inspector," she said with satisfaction. "Said it was time for action. If you ask me, they like the idea of action so long as someone else undertakes it." Perbrite accepted this information with a nod, sipping his half-pint with contemplative slowness. He had long recognized that in Flaxborough the loudest voices often coincided with the weakest understanding. Still, he knew better than to dismiss the town's judgment entirely. Even prejudice could conceal a grain of truth. Back at the station, Love was eager to act on the town's new conviction. "It seems plain enough, sir. She was caught red-handed or red-socked anyway. Everyone agrees she must be involved somehow." Purbright looked up from his paperwork, his expression mild. "Do they, Sergeant? Or is it that they prefer to agree because agreement is easier than doubt?" Love frowned. "But if she didn't put it there herself, then who did? And why?" "That," Purbright replied, "is precisely the question worth asking. You see, Sergeant, when a community finds its comfort in condemning someone, one must be especially careful not to share in their haste. It is not always the one they accuse who has reason to feel guilty." Nevertheless, appearances demanded that Purbright be seen to take the matter seriously. He invited Mrs. Tubbins back to the station, treating her not as a suspect, but as a guest deserving of courtesy. She arrived wearing her best hat, clearly determined to demonstrate composure. Purbright received her with the air of a solicitor rather than a policeman. "Mrs. Tubbins, you will understand that certain persons are inclined to view last Tuesday's incident as more than mere accident. I would be grateful if you could tell me once again how you came to discover the sock in your possession." She repeated her earlier protestations with an emphasis that suggested rehearsed indignation. Yet Purbright's quiet persistence uncovered small inconsistencies. She now recalled placing a hymn book in her bag, whereas earlier it had been spectacles. She insisted she had not noticed the sock until it was already in her hand, though one of the ladies claimed she had rummaged for several moments before producing it. Love scribbled dutifully, convinced these contradictions confirmed her guilt. Purbright, however, merely inclined his head. "Thank you, Mrs. Tubbins. You have been most helpful. I would only ask that you do not discuss this further with your friends, at least for the present." She agreed, though with the expression of a woman already calculating how her restraint might be admired when she later broke it. When she had gone, Love leaned across the desk. "You heard her, sir. She can't keep her story straight. It's obvious, isn't it?" "Obviously, perhaps," Purbright said gently, "but not necessarily correct. A flustered memory, Sergeant, is not the same as a guilty one. Besides, if she were truly concealing something serious, would she have flourished the sock before an entire circle of women?" Love considered this, then conceded the point with a reluctant shrug. Still, the momentum of suspicion was not so easily slowed. The next morning brought an anonymous letter, scrawled in uneven capitals, urging the police to look closely at Mrs. T. It was unsigned, though the neat fold of the paper and the faint trace of violet ink suggested to Purbright a feminine hand. He tucked it into the file without comment, allowing Love to marvel at how the town now produced not only rumours, but written indictments. For all the pressure, Purbright remained unmoved. He went about his duties with the same unhurried diligence, filing reports, answering correspondence, and pausing to study the sock in its envelope whenever the office grew quiet. It was not the stain that held his attention, but the ordinariness of the object itself. He felt sure that if chosen deliberately, its very banality was part of the design. One afternoon, as he walked home across the market square, Purbright paused outside Pocklington's drapery. In the window, amidst neat stacks of shirts and stockings, hung a display of socks not unlike the one in question. They were striped, dull, the sort that might belong to any number of men in town. The thought lingered with him as he resumed his walk. Perhaps the real significance of the sock lay not in what it was, but in whom it had once belonged to, and why only one had come to light. The town, meanwhile, rested content in its chosen verdict. To them the mystery was solved, even if the inspector refused to say so. In parlours and pubs alike, the phrase "poor Mrs. Tubbins" was spoken with the relish of those who knew themselves morally superior. Yet beneath the comfort of consensus, a quieter truth waited, and Purbright, patient as ever, intended to let it ripen until it could no longer be ignored. The pressure of public opinion might have been enough to close the matter in a town less practiced in cultivating its own dramas, but Flaxborough, though swift to condemn, was also endlessly inventive in extending a tale. Had Perbrite wished, he might have surrendered to the clamour, declared Mrs. Tubbins guilty of something undefined but satisfying, and let the town return to its comfortable routine. Instead, he carried on quietly, for he had noticed an element that did not quite align with the general embroidery. It was not a grand discovery, merely a remark made in passing, one that most would have dismissed at once, but it sat in his mind like a knot in an otherwise smooth skein of wool. The remark had been titular Mr. Tubbins's. He had spoken of the church bazaar, and of a missing purse, as though it were no more than a faint memory of mild embarrassment. Others might have overlooked it, but Perbrite had learned long ago that embarrassment often leaves a deeper impression than tragedy. People will forgive an accident, even a misfortune, but they rarely forget a social awkwardness that might suggest impropriety. On the Thursday afternoon he strolled into the church vestry under the pretext of asking after hymnals, and found the Reverend Longbright arranging a tottering stack of parish newsletters. The vicar greeted him with his customary air of being faintly surprised that anyone should call upon him at all. "The bazaar inspector?" he repeated when Perbrite steered their talk towards recent parish events. "Oh yes, quite successful on the whole. Funds for the roof appeal exceeded expectations. There was one small unpleasantness, a purse mislaid or taken. Belonged to Mrs. Simmons. She was rather distressed, but the matter soon quietened. Nothing further came of it." Purbright tilted his head. "Do you recall if Mrs. Tubbins was present?" The vicar adjusted his spectacles as though to bring memory into focus. "Why, yes, now you mention it. She oversaw the cake stall, a capable woman in such matters. It was she, in fact, who first suggested searching beneath the trestle tables." "Very thoughtful of her," murmured Perbrite. "And the purse itself was never found?" "No," said the vicar, his voice descending into that tone of clerical regret reserved for disappointments that fall below the threshold of moral outrage. "It was quite gone. But Mrs. Simmons was philosophical. She said she should have known better than to carry so much cash. She is, you understand, a trusting soul." Perbrite thanked him and made his way back across the square, where mist was beginning to gather once more around the market cross. The bazaar incident might in itself be nothing, yet coupled with the sock, it suggested to him a certain pattern, not a clear design, but the outline of one. That evening, Purbright took a deliberate detour past the Memorial Hall. The sewing circle was in session again, lights glowing behind the curtained windows, faint hum of chatter leaking through the door. He paused long enough to hear a ripple of laughter, nervous laughter, he thought, not untroubled amusement. No doubt the ladies had shifted from speculation to satire, for Flaxborough's citizens, when scandal threatened, often adopted mockery as both defence and pastime. The odd detail revealed itself more fully when he called next upon Miss White at Pocklington's drapery. She was rearranging a shelf of stockings, each pair folded with austere precision. Purbright, after a courteous preamble, asked if she recalled selling socks of the particular striped variety. "Dozens," she replied crisply. "Cheap, durable, countrymen like them. They don't last long, though the wool's not the best. I had a delivery of 6 dozen pairs 2 months ago, nearly all gone. Would you remember to whom you sold the last few?" Miss White gave him a look that suggested she found the question mildly insulting. "Inspector, I cannot be expected to recall every man who buys socks, but I do know Councillor Chub purchased 3 pairs only a fortnight ago. He said his old ones had worn through, large size too. His feet are notorious." Purbright inclined his head, concealing his interest. "And was Mrs. Tubbins ever a customer for such items?" "Not in my recollection. She is particular. Buys for her husband only the thicker sort. Always pays in exact change." That evening, as Perbrite sat in his office, he drew the envelope containing the sock from the drawer and compared it against the description of those sold at the drapery. It matched too neatly to ignore. Yet what truly drew his attention was not the sock itself, but the faint brown mark. He had brought it close to the lamp, studied its edge, and noted that while the centre was darker, the outline feathered as though caused not by a spill, but by seepage. Love entered, clutching the day's reports, and caught his superior in this attitude of quiet examination. "Still on about the sock, sir?" he asked, half amused, half weary. Perbrite replaced the envelope. "Yes, Sergeant, for I suspect that it is not the sock which interests us, but what the sock has touched." Love gave him a puzzled look, but Perbrite offered nothing further. Instead, he asked casually, "Do you recall, Sergeant, whether Councillor Chub attended the bazaar?" "I believe he opened it, sir. Gave a speech about the virtues of thrift. Bought a sponge cake, if memory serves." Perbrite leaned back, the hint of a smile crossing his face. "Ah, thrift. A virtue rarely practiced as warmly as it is praised." It was not a conclusion, nor even an accusation, but it was enough to keep his mind occupied, for in the midst of rumour, accusation, and indignation, this single thread, the peculiar stain on a common sock, and its resemblance to those sold recently to the very councillor now most insistent upon Mrs. Tubbins's guilt, seemed to Purbright less trivial than it appeared. And though he did not yet know what design it formed, he was patient enough to wait until the rest of the fabric revealed itself. Though Councillor Chub's feet were known to half the town, if not by sight, then certainly by reputation, Inspector Purbright did not leap to attach guilt to their owner. One did not, after all, convict a man merely because he had recently bought socks, no matter how fiercely striped. Yet the discovery added a new dimension, and Purbright understood that before any conclusion could be drawn, the field of inquiry must widen. In Flaxborough, scandal was seldom the property of a single household. It tended to ripple outward until nearly everyone was dampened by it to some degree. He began, in his customary fashion, not with confrontation, but with conversation. A visit to the lending library was as good a start as any, for there Miss Mortlake presided with an air of omniscience that only a woman who had handled every borrower's ticket could muster. She was a thin, angular figure, with spectacles perched on her nose like a permanent accusation. Purbright lingered among the shelves until she felt obliged to approach. "Good morning, Inspector. We don't often see you here unless you are investigating late returns." "Merely keeping abreast of local history," he replied mildly. "Though I wonder, Miss Mortlake, whether you might enlighten me on the recent bazaar. I understand you were present?" Her lips compressed. "Indeed. A poorly organized affair in my view. Too many raffles, insufficient cataloguing of goods. I remarked as much to Councillor Peaver, who was supposed to be supervising." She adjusted her spectacles with relish. "And then, of course, the unpleasantness with Mrs. Simmons's purse." "Yes," said Perbrite. "I have heard mention of that. Did you observe anything unusual at the time?" Miss Mortlake pursed her lips further, as though deciding which morsel to present. only that Councillor Chub seemed most agitated when the loss was announced. One would have thought his own funds had gone astray. He bustled about asking questions, but I noticed he avoided speaking directly to Mrs. Simmons. Curious, don't you think? Purbright inclined his head, as though to agree, though in truth he preferred to collect such remarks rather than credit them outright. He thanked her with quiet courtesy and left, aware that she would consider her contribution an essential step towards the restoration of order. His next call was upon Mrs. Simmons herself, who lived in a narrow house overlooking the canal. She received him with fluttering hands and the air of one who still felt faintly bruised by her loss. "Oh, Inspector, it was quite dreadful," she said, leading him into a parlour crowded with porcelain dogs. "I had only just sold 3 of my sponge cakes and the money was in my purse, along with the week's housekeeping. When I looked again, it was gone. I was quite beside myself. Mr. Simmons had to sit me down and fetch a glass of sherry." "Most distressing," Perbrite murmured. "And you never saw it again?" "Never. Though I will say this, Mrs. Tubbins was most attentive. She comforted me as though I were her own sister, and she offered to pay part of the loss herself, which of course I could not accept. Still, it was kind." Purbright noted this, thanked her, and departed, reflecting as he did that the woman most accused of dishonesty had apparently behaved with greater decency than those who maligned her. The next day he called upon Councillor Peaver at his office. Peaver was a nervous little man whose desk was perpetually buried beneath files that never seemed to diminish, no matter how often he shuffled them. He welcomed the inspector with the air of a man grateful for distraction. "The bazaar?" he said, fiddling with a paperclip. Yes, very unfortunate about the purse. Caused quite a stir. And now this business with the sock? I don't mind telling you, Inspector, the Council is most anxious to have the matter cleared up." "So I gathered," Purbright replied mildly. "Would you say Councillor Chub has shown particular interest?" Peaver hesitated. "Well, he does take things to heart. Always eager to preserve the town's reputation. A little too eager, some might say. He was most vocal about the need to uncover the thief at the bazaar, though nothing came of it. And now, well, you have seen how determined he is about Mrs. Tubbins." The inspector let the words rest. He had no intention of condemning Chub on the strength of gossip, but the repetition of his name in such different quarters was noteworthy. By Friday, the gossip itself had broadened its circle. At the butcher's, customers whispered that the missing purse had been found in the canal. At the bakery, it had transformed into a stolen brooch. And at the hairdresser's, the sock was now linked to a gentleman from Lincoln who had been seen loitering outside the Memorial Hall. Purbright knew better than to rely on such embroidery, but he also knew that within exaggeration often lay a seed of truth. It was in the hairdressers, in fact, that another thread appeared. Mrs. Palgrove, whose salon served as a nerve centre for local chatter, mentioned that Councillor Chub had visited her shop shortly after the bazaar. Wanted his hair trimmed, though heaven knows he's half bald. But what struck me was the mud on his trousers. He said he'd slipped by the canal path. I remember it, because he was terribly flustered, almost as if he wished me not to notice. Perbrite filed this away without comment, though his thoughts lingered on the canal and on what a person might hastily discard there. When he returned to the station, Love was waiting with another small nugget. "I've been asking about those socks, sir. Seems the pair you've got could match 6 men in town. But here's the thing, only Chub buys them 3 pairs at once. Most fellows take 1 or 2. Perbrite allowed himself a slight smile. "Then let us suppose, Sergeant, that Councillor Chub has more than 1 pair to account for, and if so, perhaps the missing one will yet make itself known." The sergeant looked puzzled, but Perbrite was content. He knew the investigation was expanding just as it should. Mrs. Tubbins, Miss Mortlake, Mrs. Simmons, Councillor Peaver, and now Chub himself, all were part of the tapestry, each with their own threads of truth and concealment. The pattern was not complete, but it was becoming less random with every stitch. And as Purbright extinguished his office lamp that evening, he reflected, as he so often did, that the most revealing part of human behaviour was seldom the crime itself, but the manner in which people sought to avoid, explain, or accuse. In Flaxborough, those manners were as telling as fingerprints. Saturday brought with it a weather front that appeared as reluctant to settle as the town's appetite for scandal. The wind fussed at the eaves, rattled shop signs, and swept through the market square in short, petulant gusts. It was in such a climate, both atmospheric and civic, that the second incident occurred. Where the first had been confined to a handbag and the ladies of the sewing circle, this one spilled into public view, and no amount of polite silence could contain it. The matter began at the canal, where a group of boys, armed with sticks and mischief, had taken to poking about the water's edge in search of treasures or frogs. Their enthusiasm was rewarded when one stick snagged upon something soft yet resistant. With a chorus of squeals, they hauled it up and revealed, to their mingled delight and alarm, a sodden shoe. Attached to it, still faintly clinging despite the water's effort to strip it bare, was a second sock, the fellow, it seemed, to the one discovered in Mrs. Tubbins's bag. Word travelled faster than the boys themselves, who ran shrieking into town waving their find. By the time the shoe and its limp cargo reached the police station, courtesy of a red-faced constable dispatched to intercept, half Flaxborough was already whispering that a body must be in the canal. Some insisted it had already been pulled out, while others claimed to have seen the undertaker fetching his cart. In reality, there was no corpse, merely a shoe, size large, and a sock striped in the same dull fashion as the first. Perbrite received the items with his usual calm. He spread them on his desk, blotting paper beneath to contain the damp, and studied them as though they were exhibits in some minor museum. Love, standing beside him, could not conceal his excitement. "That's it, sir, the other sock, and the shoeist must belong to Chub, surely." "Didn't Mrs. Palgrove say he'd mud on his trousers after the bazaar? Looks like he's been down there again." Perbrite raised a hand, gently, the gesture that always slowed Love's gallop. "Possibly, Sergeant. Yet possession of large feet and poor balance does not in itself constitute crime." Still he examined the shoe closely. It was a stout, unfashionable thing with laces frayed from much tugging. Inside, the leather bore the faint impression of a manufacturer's mark, Pocklington's. That alone was unremarkable, for Pocklington's drapery supplied half the town, but combined with the striped sock, also from the same establishment, the suggestion was harder to dismiss. The discovery caused a fresh flurry of talk in every corner of Flaxborough. At the grocer's, one customer announced that Councillor Chub had been seen near the canal late at night, though when pressed, she admitted she had merely noticed a figure in a dark coat. At the station, a clerk swore that Chub had bought an unusual amount of sealing wax, surely for concealing documents. Even the rector's wife, not usually given to gossip, remarked over Sunday tea that it was quite extraordinary how Councillor Chub always seemed to be hovering where trouble brewed. For his part, Chub appeared more blustery than ever. He stormed into the station on Monday morning, demanding to know why no arrest had been made. "The people of this borough," he declared, "have a right to expect decisive action. That woman is guilty, and if the police will not prove it, then the council shall have to consider measures of its own." Purbright received him with the patient expression of a man listening to a recital of parish accounts. When Chub's indignation had run to embers, he asked, in a tone of mild curiosity, "Might I inquire, councillor, whether you are missing a shoe?" The question, so gently placed, caused Chub to flush the colour of undercooked beetroot. "A shoe? Certainly not. My footwear is entirely accounted for. Why do you ask?" "No reason beyond professional tidiness," Purbright murmured. "It is always reassuring to know that nothing has been misplaced." Chub muttered something about wasted time and took his leave, but Love, watching, was convinced the man had nearly choked on his own indignation. "He's rattled, sir," the sergeant said eagerly. "Couldn't meet your eye. If you ask me, he's guilty of sin," Sergeant Perbrite replied. "When a man cannot meet my eye, it may mean guilt, but it may equally mean he has corn. We must be cautious." Nevertheless, the inspector was not blind to the significance of the second sock. That it had turned up in the canal while its twin had been secreted in Mrs. Tubbins's bag suggested deliberate dispersal rather than accident. Someone, it seemed, was scattering clues with a mind to deflect suspicion. The question was whether the scattering pointed towards concealment or towards a frame-up. To pursue the matter further, Purbright called again on Mrs. Tubbins. She received him with the weary dignity of one who had grown accustomed to being eyed askance. "Inspector," she said, "I have been prayed over, sympathized with, and shunned, all within the same day. It is very tiring." He asked gently if she had any knowledge of the shoe or the second sock. She denied it with her usual firmness, though her eyes flickered when he mentioned the canal. "I do not go near the water," she said quickly. "It chills me." Purbright let the denial pass, but his interest sharpened at her mention of chill. There was something in the way she spoke, not fear of drowning, but distaste for what might lie in that murky water. That evening he walked alone along the canal path. The reeds rustled faintly in the wind, and a moorhen skittered across the surface. He stood for a long time watching the sluggish water, as if it might rise up and confess its secrets. When at last he turned away, he carried with him not certainty but conviction. The second incident had shifted the matter beyond handbags and gossip. Whoever placed the sock in Mrs. Tubbins's possession had also consigned its partner to the canal, and though the act might have been meant to confuse to Perbrite, it suggested the very opposite. For in Flaxborough, concealment was often the surest sign of revelation. Inspector Perbrite had long cultivated the habit of letting matters ferment quietly in the recesses of his mind, rather as an old wine merchant might allow a cask to deepen in flavour. To Sergeant Love, the inspector's calm indifference to the town's cries for action could appear maddening, but Perbrite knew that the rush to conclusions was the true enemy of clarity. Now, with a sodden shoe and its striped sock retrieved from the canal, he found himself more absorbed than alarmed, for such details, trivial to most, often revealed the shape of human folly with the clearest outlines. He spent that evening in his modest rooms above the station, perched in his chair with a small lamp at his side and a notebook resting untouched on his knee. His gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, as though he were listening not to the ticking clock on the mantelpiece, but to the faint reverberations of the town's behaviour. What struck him most was not the sock, nor the shoe, nor even Councillor Chubb's bluster, but the town's eagerness to tidy away the business by thrusting blame upon Mrs. Tubbins. It was not unusual. Flaxborough had always preferred neat scapegoats. Yet beneath this eagerness he detected something more guarded, a fear almost, that the matter might expand beyond the comfort of sewing circles and bazaar tables. When a community of such modest pretensions grew anxious, it was usually because someone had more to hide than they cared to admit. Purbright recalled Mrs. Tubbins's quick protest that she avoided the canal because it chilled her. That word lingered. Chilling was not the language of inconvenience. It suggested association, a memory, something half-buried and unpleasant. And then there was Chub, whose indignation about public decency sounded a shade too much like deflection. The man's missing footwear might be coincidence, yet Purbright had never placed much faith in coincidence when it presented itself with such determination. The inspector thought too of Mr. Tubbins, whose mild astonishment at the world seemed genuine enough. The man had mentioned the bazaar with an innocence that did not fit with conspiracy, and yet his words had pointed, however, unintentionally, toward the purse that had vanished. Perbrite turned the puzzle gently as though it were a curious stone in his hand. One missing purse, 2 socks, 1 shoe. No great crime as yet, and yet together they formed the outline of mischief. By Monday morning the inspector was prepared to test the currents of opinion without revealing how intently he watched them. He began with a quiet word to Sergeant Love. "Observe, if you will, who among the councillors appears most eager to put this affair to rest. A man's urgency often betrays whether he seeks resolution or escape." Love, though puzzled, obeyed, and spent the day noting Chub's repeated appearances at the station, Peever's nervous questions, and the faint, watchful silence of Councillor Hargreaves, who seemed content to let others stir the pot. Meanwhile, Purbright allowed himself a stroll along the High Street, where conversation flowed as freely as the scent of fried fish from the chippy. He lingered near shop windows long enough to catch fragments of talk. One woman declaring that Mrs. Tubbins must be cleared for the sake of her husband's nerves, another insisting that the shoe pointed unmistakably to Chub, and yet another muttering that the canal might hold more than just lost footwear. Each remark, harmless in itself, layered upon the others until the inspector could almost hear the collective heartbeat of suspicion. That evening he wrote nothing in his notebook, preferring instead to arrange the matter in his head. He pictured the bazaar crowded with parishioners, the missing purse, the flustered Chub, the attentive Mrs. Tubbins. He imagined the sewing circle, the handbag, the sudden sock, and finally the canal yielding its soggy secret to a gang of mischievous boys. What connected them? Not theft for gain, nothing so practical. It felt more like theatre, the scattering of props for an audience easily distracted. And in Flaxborough there was no shortage of spectators. Purbright reflected on the nature of reputation. For all its gentility, the town thrived on a concealed competitiveness. Women vied over sponge cakes, men over council motions, and both over the quiet measure of respectability. A lost purse and a planted sock could ruin a standing more thoroughly than any great fraud, and to ruin a standing was often motive enough. He had seen it before. Scandals grew, not from greed, but from envy, not from malice, but from the petty thrill of watching another fall. When Love brought him the day's correspondence, Purbright found among it another anonymous note. This one, written in a cramped, agitated hand, warned that some men of high station are not what they seem. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the file with the other. Love, peering at him, asked if it meant anything. "It means," Sergeant Perbrite said quietly, "that we are not done yet. Anonymous letters, like socks, rarely appear without purpose, and when two are sent, one may be certain the writer is less concerned with truth than with directing suspicion." That night, alone once more, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. The case was no closer to resolution, and yet he felt the shape of it becoming clearer. He had no desire for dramatic revelations, no inclination to pursue suspects with vigour. What he required was patience, for the guilty party, whoever they were, was already revealing themselves in the smallest of ways: a nervous laugh, a hurried denial, a misplaced shoe. And so, as the town fretted over whether Mrs. Tubbins was a thief or whether Councillor Chub was a hypocrite, Purbright leaned back in his chair and considered the broader truth. In Flaxborough, Guilt was seldom hidden for long. It tended, like water in the canal, to rise to the surface when stirred. All that remained was to wait for the next ripple. Inspector Purbright decided that the time had come not to collect more talk, of which there was already an abundance, but to place a conversational stone in the stream and watch how the current shifted around it. He had always found that in Flaxborough, truth did not need to be dragged forth with force. It preferred to betray itself in the form of a blush, a stumble, or a too hasty denial. His task was simply to provide the occasion. The opportunity presented itself at the Tuesday meeting of the Borough Council, where councillors gathered in their accustomed seats beneath the dusty portraits of past worthies. Perbrite, who had been invited to report on progress in the matter of recent disturbances, arrived with the quiet gravity of a man unlikely to exaggerate. He did not intend to deliver progress so much as to scatter a few carefully chosen remarks. The meeting was already heated. Councillor Chub, swelling with indignation, demanded immediate measures to preserve the reputation of our good town. Councillor Peaver shuffled papers nervously, while Councillor Hargreaves looked on with the calm detachment of one who knew that silence was the safest contribution. Purbright rose when prompted, adjusted his spectacles, and said with mild courtesy, "Gentlemen, I can report that the police are in possession of certain items, 2 socks of matching pattern, and 1 shoe that may be of interest. These are presently under examination. I am, of course, concerned with establishing not merely their ownership, but the circumstances of their dispersal." A murmur passed round the room, and several heads turned instinctively towards Chub. He coloured, then coughed loudly, as if to dispel any suspicion by volume alone. "Ownership, Inspector," Chub blustered, "is surely a simple matter to establish. Every man in this town knows his own footwear. You cannot expect us to tremble over a couple of damp socks." Perbrite inclined his head slightly. "Quite so, Councillor. Yet it is curious, is it not, how one of them found its way into Mrs. Tubbins's handbag, while the other was consigned to the canal? Such a distribution suggests less the absent-mindedness of laundry than a deliberate hand." Chub shifted in his seat, his collar glistening faintly. Peaver cleared his throat and muttered something most irregular, while Hargreaves folded his hands and stared at the floor with commendable neutrality. "I do not propose to draw conclusions here," Perbrite continued smoothly, "but it would be of great assistance if any gentleman who has recently mislaid an item of this description might come forward. It would spare us all a great deal of unnecessary speculation." The silence that followed was thick enough to weigh upon the dusty portraits. Chub, who had opened his mouth, as if to speak, shut it again with a snap. Purbright, observing this with mild detachment, sat down. He had no need of declarations. The hesitation itself was eloquent. Later, as the councillors dispersed, Purbright lingered in the corridor long enough to exchange a word with Chub. He remarked, in his quietest tone, "It must be most inconvenient to lose a shoe, Councillor. One hopes it has not left you at a disadvantage." Chub's face grew a shade deeper, and he muttered something indistinct about cobblers before hurrying away. Purbright did not pursue him, but the sergeant, who had witnessed the exchange, was nearly trembling with suppressed excitement. "You've got him, sir?" He looked ready to bolt. "Possibly," said Purbright, fastening his overcoat, "but bolting is not quite the same as confessing. Let us allow him time to consider whether silence will protect him." The following day, Purbright arranged to visit Mrs. Simmons once more, under the pretext of inquiring about her health. Over tea, he remarked with studied casualness, "It is odd how the purse was never found, when so many eyes were upon the bazaar. One might have expected something to turn up by the canal, if indeed it had been discarded there." Mrs. Simmons, startled, replied, "Why, yes, Inspector, that is curious. But no, I mustn't speculate. Purbright encouraged her gently. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the room. Unless it was taken by someone who would never dare to be seen near the canal. Someone with a standing to protect. Perbrite sipped his tea, offering no comment. It was precisely the kind of speculation he required, not for its accuracy, but for the light it cast on how townsfolk interpreted the drama. Each theory revealed as much about the speaker's anxieties as about the facts themselves. When he returned to the station, he set about what Love called tidying his thoughts, which usually meant a long spell of silence. Finally, he said, "Sergeant, let us imagine that the socks were never meant to be discovered together. That one was planted and the other discarded. The question is, why distribute them so?" Love frowned. "To confuse us, sir? Perhaps. Or to ensure that suspicion touched more than one person. Mrs. Tubbins with her handbag, the canal with its history of gossip, and a counsellor with his bluster. It begins to look less like theft than mischief of a calculated sort." Love scratched his head, struggling to keep up. "Then who's guilty, sir?" Perbrite gave his faint smile. "Ah, Sergeant, the guilty party has already betrayed themselves. All we need is to provide the occasion for their nerves to betray them more fully." It was with that intention that he began to plan a small but deliberate test. He did not require warrants or interrogations, only an ordinary social encounter where the right remark, dropped gently as a stitch, might unravel the whole fabric. And in Flaxborough, where reputations were stitched together as carefully as embroidery at the sewing circle, he knew the guilty would not withstand a single tug. Perbrite's idea of a test was never the melodramatic staging of detectives in novels with trapdoors and sudden lights, but a gentle, almost courteous arrangement of circumstances in which the guilty might stumble of their own accord. He believed that if one gave human nature enough room to reveal itself, it would seldom fail to oblige. Thus he decided that the next sewing circle meeting should provide the stage. Few places in Flaxborough offered such a rich mixture of witnesses, rivalries, and opportunities for genteel discomposure. On the appointed evening, Perbrite presented himself at the Memorial Hall with a politeness that made even the more censorious ladies blink with a thrill of official recognition. He had arranged beforehand, through a word with Mrs. Poole, that he might say a few words before the sewing commenced. This gave the gathering a sense of solemnity, as if their humble gathering had suddenly acquired the dignity of a civic inquest. Purbright stood by the piano, his figure modest, yet commanding by virtue of its very calmness. "Ladies," he began, "and gentlemen of any should be persuaded to join us. I must apologize for intruding upon your industrious evening. I come merely to clarify certain matters that have caused unnecessary unease." Every needle paused in mid-air. Miss Bellringer fixed him with the look of a woman prepared to endorse any verdict so long as it was damning. Mrs. Tubbins sat stiffly, her handbag clutched on her lap, as though she expected it to be searched at once. The rest leaned forward, eager for confirmation of their prejudices. "I have here," Perbrite continued, 2 socks and a shoe. They are of a common type, sold at Pocklington's drapery to several respectable gentlemen of this town. One of these socks was discovered in Mrs. Tubbins's handbag. The other, together with the shoe, was retrieved from the canal. Now it might be tempting to view these items as mere coincidence, but coincidence is a poor explanation for deliberate placement. There was a rustle, and more than one pair of eyes darted, without subtlety, toward Mrs. Tubbins. She flushed, but Perbrite raised a hand. "I must emphasize that Mrs. Tubbins is not, in my opinion, responsible for this curious distribution. The sock was placed in her bag without her knowledge. It was intended to compromise her standing, to make her appear foolish or dishonest before her friends." In short, ladies, it was a trick. A murmur rose, half relief, half disappointment. Miss Bellringer sniffed as if to suggest that absolution robbed her of a good story. Such tricks, Purbright went on, are seldom aimless. They are the work of someone who desires to deflect attention from themselves. The purse that vanished at the bazaar, I need hardly remind you, was never recovered. But a purse may easily be disposed of, while a sock or a shoe carries the hint of its owner's identity. It was therefore thought expedient to scatter them, to ensure confusion. He let the words sink in. The ladies exchanged glances. Mrs. Poole looked distinctly smug at being in possession of so much official drama. It was at this point that the door opened and Councillor Chub entered, puffing slightly from the effort of mounting the steps. The timing could not have been better had Perbrite arranged it himself. He turned with a mild smile. "Councillor, how fortunate! We were just speaking of footwear. Perhaps you might assist us. Do you, by chance, recognize this shoe?" He lifted it delicately from its paper wrapping and held it up. The councillor's eyes widened. For a moment he appeared about to deny it, but the sight of so many women's faces fixed upon him seemed to wither his bluster. He stammered, Why, it looks not unlike mine, but then half the men in town." "Quite so," Perbrite agreed smoothly, "yet it is remarkable how few of them buy 3 pairs at once, all of the same size. Miss White at the drapery calls your purchase most clearly. It is, I think, unlikely that anyone else should have mislaid such an article by the canal." Chub's collar glistened again. He began to mutter about mud, about slipping, about careless boys who might have stolen the shoe. But the more he spoke, the more entangled his explanations became. The ladies, their needles forgotten, watched him with something approaching glee. Even Mrs. Tubbins, though still stiff with outrage, seemed to sense the scales shifting. Perbrite did not press further. He merely placed the shoe back in its wrapping and said quietly, "It is never easy to preserve reputation, Councillor. But sometimes the attempt to misdirect suspicion only brings more attention upon oneself. Perhaps when the matter of the purse is resolved, we shall find that its disappearance and these stray garments have more in common than appears." The silence that followed was deep enough to reveal every tick of the hall's ancient clock. Chub dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, mumbled an excuse, and left abruptly. The door closed behind him with a finality that needed no policeman to underscore. The ladies broke into whispers, a flurry of speculation that would, by morning, fill the town with new certainty. Some declared Chub a thief outright, others insisted he had been framed, and a few began to construct theories in which the missing purse had contained secrets too scandalous to mention. For Perbrite, it was enough. He had no need of confessions shouted from rooftops. The councillor's faltering denials, his ill-chosen words, and his sudden retreat had told him more than any signed statement. Walking back to the station with Love at his side, Perbrite reflected aloud. "It is curious, Sergeant, how a man's eagerness to condemn others so often reveals his own fear of condemnation. Our councillor has been most diligent in urging us to act, but tonight he acted rather too much for his own good." Love was grinning broadly. "You've got him, sir. Everyone could see it." Perbrite gave a small shake of the head. "What they saw, Sergeant, was a man unsettled. What remains is to show them what unsettled him and why. For the town will not be content with hints. It will demand the story stitched together, every piece of thread in place." He spoke not with triumph, but with the calm assurance of a man preparing the final stages of a puzzle. The time for reflections and quiet manoeuvres was nearly past. Soon he would gather those concerned, and in the politest of tones reveal the truth that had been concealed beneath socks, handbags, and the restless waters of the canal. The next afternoon, with the town's gossip running faster than the wind that tugged at the bunting along the market square, Inspector Purbright arranged for a small gathering in the mayor's parlour. It was not a formal court, nor an official inquiry. He had no appetite for that kind of display, but rather a civil conversation, attended by those whose names had threaded themselves into the story: Mrs. Tubbins, pale but resolute; Mrs. Simmons, nervous with her husband in tow; Miss Bellringer, determined not to miss the collapse of any reputation; Councillor Peaver, shifting anxiously in his chair; and, most reluctantly, Councillor Chub, who arrived late, perspiring freely, and protesting that his time was better spent on borough matters. Perbrite welcomed them with his usual courtesy, as though he were hosting a tea party rather than presiding over the unravelling of a scandal. Sergeant Love took up his place by the fireplace, clutching his notebook with the solemnity of a man about to record history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Perbrite began, "I have troubled you today not to accuse, but to clarify. Much has been said, and more imagined, about a sock, a shoe, and a missing purse. These things, though ordinary in themselves, have together created unnecessary suspicion and distress. It is time, I think, to set matters straight." Mrs. Tubbins, clutching her handbag as if it might yet turn against her, nodded vigorously. Miss Bellringer sniffed. Chub gave a short, contemptuous laugh. Perbrite continued, his tone as gentle as if explaining parish accounts. The purse, as we know, disappeared during the church bazaar. At the time, much was made of Mrs. Simmons's carelessness. Yet one detail struck me, that Councillor Chub, though loudly demanding its recovery, avoided speaking to Mrs. Simmons directly. A small thing but revealing, for he had reason to fear recognition. Chub shifted, his mouth opening, but Perbrite pressed on with calm inevitability. When the purse vanished, it was not stolen by a stranger, nor by Mrs. Tubbins, who was busy minding her stall. It was taken by Councillor Chub. He found himself in sudden need of money, a matter of private debts, I believe, and thought the crowded bazaar was an easy opportunity. But theft leaves traces, and when rumours began to circulate, he feared discovery. That is when the trick began. Gasps escaped the room, subdued only by the inspector's unhurried tone. The sock placed in Mrs. Tubbins's handbag was not a careless accident. It was a deliberate attempt to draw ridicule upon her, to make her seem the kind of woman who might pilfer or conceal. The other sock, together with the shoe, was discarded in the canal to suggest confusion rather than clarity. Unfortunately for the councillor, mischief rarely conceals guilt, it only multiplies the questions. Chub sprang half out of his chair, colour rising in blotches. "This is outrageous! Baseless slander! Anyone might have lost a shoe." "Indeed," Perbrite said softly, "but few would lose it while buying 3 pairs of identical socks only days before. Few would blush so readily when asked if they recognized the very shoe dredged from the water, and fewer still would send anonymous letters to the police, directing suspicion toward others. The hand that wrote those notes was the same that signed your council minutes, councillor. The similarity of ink and hand is unmistakable." Mrs. Simmons pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide. Mrs. Tubbins let out a triumphant exhalation, though she quickly disguised it as a cough. Miss Bellringer's lips pursed in reluctant admiration, for she had to admit the inspector had stitched his case with precision. Chub attempted another protest, but the energy had gone from him. His words stumbled, then faltered into silence. It was Peaver, timid but unable to resist, who whispered, "I always thought there was something unusual in his eagerness." Perbrite inclined his head. "Quite so. True eagerness seeks resolution. False eagerness seeks concealment." Councillor Chub mistook noise for defence. He folded his hands. The purse itself, I fear, may never be recovered. But its loss is less important than the lesson that concealment, once begun, demands ever greater folly to maintain. A sock in a handbag, a shoe in a canal, such inventions are bound to unravel. The gathering ended not with applause nor outrage, but with the quiet shock that comes when people recognize a neighbor's downfall as both inevitable and uncomfortably familiar. Mrs. Tubbins departed with her head high, already rehearsing in her mind how to describe her vindication to the sewing circle. Mrs. Simmons clutched her husband's arm, murmuring relief. Miss Bellringer swept out with the air of one who had always suspected as much. Councillor Peaver mopped his brow and resolved never to buy socks in bulk. As for Chub, he left under escort, his bluster reduced to mutters about misunderstandings. He would not face prison. Purbright knew such petty thefts were more likely to result in quiet resignation than formal charges, but his reputation, once the only garment he truly prized, was beyond mending. When the last had gone, Perbrite returned to his desk at the station. He settled among his papers with the calm satisfaction of a man who had completed not a triumph, but a duty. Sergeant Love, still flushed with excitement, said, "You've done it again, sir. Right from the start you saw it." Purbright smiled faintly, dipping his pen into the inkwell. "Not quite, Sergeant. I merely noticed what others chose not to, that the smallest stitches can reveal the whole pattern, if one is patient enough to follow the thread." Outside, the town resumed its familiar hum. Shop shutters rattled, children shouted, the market square bustled once more. Life in Flaxborough settled back into its routines, though with the faint, lingering sense that scandals, like socks, might turn up in the unlikeliest of places. And in the quiet of his office, Inspector Purbright bent again to paperwork, content to let the town stitch its own tales until the next thread of mischief appeared.